U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening to impose a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States.
New tariff threat aimed at Canada, and the president is also insulting the Canadian Prime Minister, calling him Governor Carney.
Power struggles between nations rarely begin with tanks rolling across borders or fighter jets filling the sky. More often, they begin quietly, with a sentence, a post, a warning that sounds dramatic in the moment but slowly reshapes alliances, economies, and futures. This story begins with one such warning, a message that instantly sent shockwaves through North America and raised serious questions about the future of one of the world's closest alliances. On a quiet Saturday, U.S. President Donald Trump issued one of his most aggressive trade threats yet. This time, the target was not China directly, but America's closest ally and neighbor, Canada. The message was blunt, public, and impossible to ignore. If Canada makes a trade deal with China, Trump said, the United States will respond with a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the U.S. There was no room for compromise in the wording. It was not framed as negotiation. It was framed as punishment. Posting on Truth Social, Trump painted a dark picture of Canada's future if it moved closer to Beijing. He warned that China would eat Canada alive, claiming it would destroy Canadian businesses, tear apart its social fabric, and erase its way of life. The language was emotional, dramatic, and absolute, designed not just to warn Canada, but to rally domestic support and send a message to every country watching. The threat carried weight because it came from a president who had used tariffs before, and used them aggressively. Trump's first term was marked by trade wars, sudden policy shifts, and a willingness to pressure both rivals and allies. Markets remembered that. Governments remembered that. Canada remembered that. What made this moment especially explosive was timing. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, had recently taken visible steps toward deeper engagement with China. During a visit to Beijing, Carney described China as a reliable and predictable partner, a phrase that immediately raised eyebrows in Washington. In a world where U.S. officials increasingly describe China as a strategic competitor, such language stood out. Soon after, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Carney went even further. Speaking before global political and business leaders, he openly encouraged European nations to seek investment from the world's second-largest economy. He argued that economic cooperation should not be weaponized and warned against the growing use of tariffs as tools of political pressure. That message did not sit well with Trump. From the White House perspective, the concern was not just diplomatic, it was strategic. Trump suggested that China would attempt to use Canada as a backdoor into the American market. In his words, Canada could become a drop-off port for Chinese goods, allowing products to quietly enter the United States under a different label and avoid U.S. tariffs. Trump rejected that possibility outright. He warned that if Canada tried to play such a role, the response would be immediate and severe. A 100% tariff would effectively double the cost of Canadian exports overnight, making them uncompetitive in their most important market. For Canada, this was not a symbolic threat. It was a direct economic warning. The United States is Canada's largest trading partner by a wide margin. Every day, billions of dollars in goods cross the U.S.-Canada border. Energy flows south. Vehicles and auto parts move in both directions. Agricultural products, machinery, timber, metals, and consumer goods all depend on a deeply integrated supply chain built over decades. A tariff of that scale would not just hurt Canadian exporters, it would disrupt factories, farms, and logistics systems on both sides of the border. Prices would rise, contracts would be renegotiated, jobs would come under pressure. Yet the tension between Washington and Ottawa did not appear overnight. It had been building quietly, piece by piece, long before Trump's latest warning. Just days before the tariff threat, Trump had taken another unexpected step. He withdrew Canada's invitation to join his proposed Board of Peace initiative, a platform he claimed would help resolve global conflicts. The move surprised many observers, especially given the long history of military, political, and economic cooperation between the two countries. That reversal followed Carney's Davos speech, where he openly criticized powerful nations for using economic integration as a weapon. Without naming the United States directly, he warned against turning trade into a tool of coercion and tariffs into leverage for political compliance. The message was clear enough for anyone paying attention. From Washington's point of view, Carney's comments crossed a line. They suggested resistance, independence, a refusal to align automatically with U.S. economic strategy. What made the situation even more volatile was the broader global context. The United States and China were already locked in a renewed economic rivalry. Tariffs, export controls, technology bans, and investment restrictions had become standard tools in that conflict. Any sign that a close U.S. ally might drift closer to Beijing was bound to trigger a reaction. Trump's approach was consistent with his long-held belief that trade equals leverage, and leverage should be used aggressively. In his view, allowing Canada to deepen ties with China would weaken America's economic defenses and undermine the pressure campaign designed to contain Beijing's influence. Canada, however, saw the situation through a very different lens. From Ottawa's perspective, diversification was no longer optional. It was survival. Global trade had become unpredictable. Supply chains had proven fragile during crises. Political decisions in Washington could change overnight, sometimes announced on social media rather than through formal channels. For Canadian policymakers, engaging with China was not about choosing sides in a global power struggle. It was about reducing dependence on a single partner and building resilience in an uncertain world. That difference in worldview sat at the heart of the conflict. Trump framed the issue as protection. Carney framed it as resilience. This clash revealed a deeper question facing many U.S. allies today. How much independence is acceptable in a world increasingly divided into economic blocs? And who gets to decide where the limits are drawn? For Canadian businesses, the uncertainty was immediate. A 100% tariff does not need to be implemented to cause damage. Markets react to risk long before laws change. Investors hesitate. Expansion plans slow. Long-term contracts are reconsidered. Companies that rely on cross-border trade suddenly have to prepare for worst-case scenarios. Supply chains that once felt stable begin to look vulnerable. Even the threat alone reshapes behavior. American companies were not immune either. Supply chains between the two countries are deeply intertwined. Canadian components feed U.S. manufacturing plants. Canadian energy powers American homes and industries. Agriculture on both sides depends on open borders and predictable rules. A trade war between the two neighbors would not be one-sided. It would create winners and losers on both sides of the border, and plenty of collateral damage. Yet Trump's warning was designed to send a clear signal, not just to Canada, but to every country watching closely. Aligned too closely with China, and access to the U.S. market comes at a price. As tensions rose, analysts began asking uncomfortable questions. Could Canada realistically deepen ties with China without risking retaliation from its closest ally? Was the United States prepared to follow through on such an extreme tariff? And what would this mean for the future of North American cooperation? The answers were far from clear. What was clear, however, was that the era of quiet assumptions was over. The idea that close allies could balance relationships between Washington and Beijing without consequences was fading fast. This was no longer just about trade numbers or tariffs on paper. It was about power, influence, and the rules of engagement in a fractured global economy. And as both sides hardened their positions, one thing became certain. A single trade deal, or even the hint of one, now had the power to reshape an entire alliance. This was not just a warning to Canada, it was a message to the world.